Hello, everybody. As the sun sets, I'm getting ready for bedtime, and I was hoping I could read you guys two versions of the same story. The regular story, Goodnight Moon, we all know, and a fun version called Goodnight Goon. But we'll start with our traditional story first. Goodnight Rune by Margaret Wise Brown. In the great green room, there was a telephone and a red balloon and a picture of the cow jumping over the moon. And there were 3 little bears sitting on chairs. And 2 little kittens and a pair of mittens and a little toy house and a young mouse. And a comb and a brush and a bowl full of mush. And a quiet old lady who was whispering, hush. Good night, room. Good night, moon. Good night, cow, jumping over the moon. Good night, light and the red balloon. Good night, bears. Good night, chairs. Good night, kittens. And good night, mittens. Good night, clocks. And good night, socks. Good night, little house. And good night, mouse. Good night, comb, and good night, brush. Good night, nobody. Good night, mush. And good night to the old lady, whispering, hush. Good night, stars. Good night, air. Good night, noises everywhere. The end. Now, I have a silly version of Goodnight Moon called Goodnight Goon, a petrifying parody by Michael Rex. In the old gray tomb, there was a gravestone and a black lagoon and a picture of Martians taking over the moon. And there were 3 little mummies rubbing their tummies. And 2 hairy claws and a set of jaws and a loud screechy bat and a black hat. And a skull and a shoe and a pot full of goo and a hairy old werewolf who was hollering, boo. Good night, tomb. Good night, goon. Good night, Martians taking over the moon. Good night, bones and the black lagoon. Good night, mummies. Good night, tummies. Good night, claws. And good night, jaws. Good night, moans. And good night, groans. Good night, screechy bat. And good night, hat. Good night, skull. And good night, shoe. Good night, creature. Good night, goo. And good night to the werewolf hollering, boo. Good night, you. Get under there. Good night, monsters everywhere. The end. If you guys aren't already, get yourself all tucked in and say goodnight to all the things in your room too. I'm headed off to bedtime. Good night, everybody.